The Great Hall of the Galactic Council stretched beyond what human eyes could easily see. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy filled the massive space, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. Some looked like walking crystals that caught and reflected light in rainbow patterns. Others were made of what appeared to be living gas, shifting and flowing in colors that had no names. There were beings that looked like trees with eyes, creatures that seemed to be made of pure energy, and things so strange that even after years of contact, humans still struggled to understand what they were looking at. Ambassador Helen Carter stood at the human section, her hands folded calmly as she watched the proceedings. She had been Earth's representative to the Galactic Council for 15 years now, and she had seen many amazing things in that time. Today was special, though. Today was the annual celebration of resilience, where each species shared their greatest story of survival and strength. The Zephyrian delegate had just finished telling the story of how their people survived when their home star began to die. They had somehow managed to move their entire civilization to a new solar system, carrying their cities through space like ships. The audience had responded with the various sounds and lights that different species used to show approval. Now it was the crystalline hegemony's turn. Their representative, a being that looked like a walking mountain of diamond, shared how their people had survived the collapse of their home planet's core. They had learned to live in the deep spaces between worlds, feeding on cosmic radiation and stellar winds. Again, the audience responded with amazement. One by one, each species told their tale. The gas dancers spoke of surviving a galactic storm that had lasted 300 years. The tree speakers told of rebuilding their forest, worlds after a plague that turned wood to dust. Each story was more incredible than the last, filled with technology beyond human understanding and survival on scales that made human problems seem tiny. Then came Earth's turn. Helen stood slowly and walked to the center of the great speaking circle. The hall grew quiet as thousands of alien eyes, sensors, and awareness fields focused on her. She was small compared to most of the other delegates, her simple blue diplomatic uniform making her look even more ordinary next to the exotic forms around her. "Friends of the galaxy," Helen began, her voice carried to every corner of the hall by technology that translated her words into thousands of languages and communication methods. "Earth wishes to share our story of resilience, but our story is not about surviving cosmic disasters or moving planets or rebuilding civilizations." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the alien delegates seemed confused. What else could a story of resilience be about? "Our story," Helen continued, "is about two humans. They are here with us today." She gestured toward the human section, and two very elderly people began making their way slowly toward the speaking circle. They moved carefully, supporting each other as they walked. The man was bent with age, his hair completely white, his face lined with nearly a century of living. The woman beside him was equally old, her steps small and measured, but her eyes bright and alert. The alien audience watched with growing puzzlement as the two ancient humans made their way to where Helen stood. These beings looked fragile, worn, down by time. They seemed like they might break if touched too roughly. What kind of survival story could such frail creatures possibly have? "I present to you Peter Kozlov and Maria Volkov," Helen announced as the elderly pair reached her side. They are both 102 years old. This caused more murmuring. While some species in the galaxy lived for thousands of years, others burned bright and brief like candles. Humans were known to live roughly 100 years under good conditions, so these two were clearly very old by human standards. "These two survived something that happened when they were children," Helen continued. "Something we call Chernobyl." The name meant nothing to the assembled beings. They had heard thousands of words from thousands of worlds, but this one was new. Yet the way Helen spoke, it suggested great importance, great weight. "To understand their story," Helen said, "you must first understand what humans were like when Peter and Maria were young. We were a single-planet species then. We had no contact with the galaxy beyond our world. We had only recently learned to split the atom, to release the power locked inside the smallest pieces of matter. Some of the more advanced species in the audience made sounds that might have been amusement. Atomic power was child's play to civilizations that could move stars and build worlds. We were using this atomic power to make energy for our cities, Helen explained. But we were still learning, still making mistakes. On April 26th, in the year 1986 by our calendar, one of our atomic power plants exploded. The crystalline delegates' form shifted slightly, colors changing, and what humans had learned was their equivalent of interest. Energy beings began to pulse with different rhythms. Even the gas dancers seemed to slow their eternal movement. The explosion released invisible poison into the air, Helen continued. Radiation, we call it. It spread across the land like a silent plague, killing or sickening everything it touched. Humans, animals, plants, all suffered from this invisible death. Now the audience was truly listening. Every species understood disaster, understood death spreading across a world. Peter and Maria were children living near this explosion. They were 6 and 5 years old respectively when it happened. They breathed the poisoned air. They drank contaminated water. The radiation entered their small bodies and began destroying them from the inside. Helen paused, letting this sink in. She looked at the 2 elderly humans standing beside her, then back at the assembled galaxy. Most children exposed to such radiation die quickly. Human bodies, especially young ones, cannot handle such damage. Peter and Maria should have died within weeks or months. Instead, they lived. They survived. And their survival became something more than just staying alive. The hall was completely silent now. Even the energy beings had stopped their constant motion. But their story is not just about surviving radiation poisoning, Helen said. It is about what they did with that survival, what they created from their pain, what they built from their shared suffering. She gestured to the 2 elderly humans who were now holding hands, supporting each other as they had for nearly a century. Peter and Maria turned their survival into something beautiful, something that has touched millions of lives across our world and beyond. Today, they will share with you what human resilience truly means. The audience waited, captivated, despite themselves by these 2 fragile beings who had somehow turned childhood catastrophe into something worth sharing with the galaxy. Helen raised her hand and the air above the speaking circle began to shimmer. Advanced holographic technology, shared by the galaxy's more developed species, created a 3-dimensional image that filled the space above their heads. The alien delegates found themselves looking down at a human city as it had existed more than a century ago. The city was called Pripyat, and it looked like many human settlements of that time. Tall concrete buildings reached toward the sky, their windows reflecting the morning sun. People moved through the streets below, going about their daily lives. Children played in parks while their parents worked in nearby factories. It looked peaceful, normal, safe. This was April 25, 1986, Helen explained, as the hologram showed the city in the early morning hours. Peter and Maria lived here with their families. Look closely and you will see them. The image focused on a small apartment building. Through one window, a 6-year-old boy with dark hair could be seen eating breakfast with his parents. His name was Peter Kozlov, though at that age he understood little about the world beyond his immediate surroundings. In another building nearby, 5-year-old Maria Volkov was getting dressed for what her parents thought would be a normal day. The children knew nothing of atomic power. Helen continued. They did not understand radiation or nuclear reactors, or the dangers that humans were still learning to control. They were simply children, as innocent and unaware as children everywhere. The hologram shifted to show a large industrial complex on the edge of the city. Massive cooling towers released steam into the sky, and a collection of buildings housed the machinery that provided power to the region. It looked impressive and modern, a symbol of human technological achievement. This was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Helen said. For years it had safely provided energy to the surrounding area. The humans who worked there were proud of their achievement, proud of their mastery over atomic forces. The scene changed to show the interior of the power plant. Human workers moved through corridors filled with complex machinery. They wore special clothing and carried devices that measured radiation levels. Everything appeared orderly and controlled. But on April 26th, during a routine test, something went terribly wrong. The hologram showed the moment of disaster. Inside, Reactor 4, a chain reaction began that the operators could not stop. The carefully controlled atomic process became wild and dangerous. In seconds, the reactor core exploded with tremendous force. The alien audience watched in fascination as the holographic recreation showed the explosion tearing through the reactor building. Radioactive material shot high into the sky, carried by wind and weather across vast distances. The invisible poison that Helen had mentioned began its deadly spread. The humans in charge tried to keep the disaster secret at first, Helen explained. They did not want to cause panic. They told people in Pripyat that everything was safe, that there was no danger. The hologram showed the city on the morning of April 26th. People went to work as usual. Children played outside. Parents sent their kids to school. Nobody knew that with each breath they were taking radioactive particles into their bodies. For Peter and Maria, that day started like any other. Helen continued. Peter went to his kindergarten class. Maria played with her toys at home. Their parents had no idea that their children were being slowly poisoned by the air they breathed. The scene shifted to show the two children during those crucial hours. Peter was in a classroom, with other children, learning simple songs and playing games. Maria was in a playground running and laughing with friends. Both looked healthy and happy, unaware that their bodies were already beginning to absorb dangerous levels of radiation. It was not until the evening of April 27th that authorities finally admitted the truth, Helen said. More than a day after the explosion, they finally ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. The hologram showed the chaos that followed. Buses arrived to take people away from the contaminated city. Families were told they could only bring essential items, that they would be able to return home in a few days. Many left their doors unlocked, expecting to come back soon. Peter and Maria's families were among the last to leave, Helen explained. By the time they were evacuated, both children had been exposed to radiation levels that would have killed most adults. The alien audience watched as the holographic recreation showed the evacuation buses leaving Pripyat. The city that had been full of life and activity just days before was now empty and silent. Inside one of the buses, 6-year-old Peter sat with his parents, confused about why they had to leave their home. In another bus, 5-year-old Maria cried because she had been forced to leave her favorite doll behind. What the children did not know, Helen continued, was that they would never see their home again. Pripyat remains empty to this day, too contaminated for human habitation. The hologram showed the abandoned city as it looked in later years. Nature had begun to reclaim the buildings. Trees grew through cracks in the pavement. Wild animals roamed through empty apartments. It had become a ghost town, a monument to human mistakes and the power of the atom. But this is not a story about human failure, Helen said firmly. This is a story about what happened next, about how two poisoned children refused to let disaster define their lives. The scene changed to show refugee centers where the evacuated families were taken. Medical teams examined the children and adults who had been exposed to radiation. Many were already showing signs of sickness. Hair was falling out, skin was burning, immune systems were failing. Peter and Maria both became very ill, Helen explained. They developed what humans call radiation sickness. Their hair fell out, they could not keep food down. They ran high fevers that the doctors struggled to control. The holographic images showed the two children in hospital beds looking pale and weak. Their parents stayed beside them, not knowing if their children would survive the next day or the next week. During the chaos of treatment and evacuation, Peter and Maria were separated from their families, Helen continued. Their parents were sent to different treatment centers. The children found themselves alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. The alien delegates watched as the hologram showed the two children in different medical facilities, surrounded by strangers, confused and frightened. They were too young to understand what had happened to them, too young to know if they would ever see their families again. Most children exposed to such high levels of radiation die within the first year, Helen said quietly. The human body, especially a young one, simply cannot handle such damage. Peter and Maria should not have survived. The hologram faded, leaving the alien audience to contemplate what they had seen. Here were two beings who had survived something that should have killed them. who had lived through a disaster that destroyed their home and separated them from everything they knew. But Helen's tone suggested that this was only the beginning of their story. The holographic display shifted to show the years that followed the disaster. Peter and Maria, now aged 7 and 6, were living in different state-run facilities across what was then the Soviet Union. The alien audience watched as the two children struggled through the aftermath of their radiation exposure. Peter found himself in a medical facility in Moscow, far from his home and family. The building was gray and institutional, filled with other children who had been affected by various disasters and accidents. He spent months in bed, his small body fighting the effects of the invisible poison that had entered his system. His hair had fallen out completely, making him look like a tiny old man. The doctors who treated him spoke in whispers, not expecting him to live through the winter. Maria was in a similar facility in Kiev, closer to her original home but still surrounded by strangers. She too had lost her hair and suffered from the burning sickness that radiation brought. Her immune system was so damaged that even a simple cold could have killed her. She spent her days in a sterile room, looking out the window at a world she was too sick to join. For 3 years, Peter and Maria lived this way, Helen explained to the assembled delegates, moving from one medical facility to another, undergoing treatments that human science barely understood. They were case studies, examples of what radiation could do to the human body. The hologram showed the children as they grew, slowly recovering from the worst effects of their exposure. Peter learned to walk again after months of weakness. Maria's hair began to grow back, though it came in a different color than before. Both children bore invisible scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Their families tried to stay in contact, but the medical system made it difficult, Helen continued. Parents were told that the children needed specialized care that only certain facilities could provide. Many families were broken apart by the disaster, scattered across the country as authorities tried to deal with the consequences of Chernobyl. When Peter turned 10 and Maria 9, they were both transferred to a new facility in Kiev that specialized in long-term care for radiation survivors. This building was different from the others they had known. It had windows that actually opened, rooms with more than one bed, and staff who seemed to see the children as more than just medical cases. It was here, in the spring of 1992, that Peter and Maria met for the first time. Peter was walking slowly down a hallway, still weak from his most recent treatment, when he heard something unusual. Music was coming from one of the common rooms, not the recorded music that usually played over the facility's speakers, but something live and immediate. He followed the sound and found a girl about his age, sitting at an old piano, playing a simple melody with fingers that still shook from the effects of medication. The girl was Maria, though neither child knew the other's name yet. She had discovered the piano in the common room and found that when she played it, the constant ache in her body seemed to lessen. The music gave her something to focus on other than the pain and uncertainty that had defined her life for so many years. Peter stood in the doorway listening. He had always loved music, even during the worst days of his illness. His grandmother had sung to him before the disaster, teaching him old Russian folk songs that connected him to something larger than his small world of medical treatments and hospital beds. "That song is sad," Peter said quietly. Maria looked up, startled. She was not used to other children approaching her. Most of the kids in the facilities were too sick or too withdrawn to socialize much. "Everything is sad," Maria replied, but she did not stop playing. Peter walked closer to the piano. "My grandmother taught me a song that goes with that melody. Do you want to hear it?" Maria nodded and Peter began to sing. His voice was weak and scratchy from years of illness, but he remembered the words his grandmother had taught him. The melody Maria was playing matched perfectly with the old song about a bird that lost its nest, but found a new home in the heart of someone who understood its pain. "We both know sad songs," Maria said when Peter finished singing. "Maybe we can learn some happy ones too," Peter suggested. From that day forward, the two children spent their time together whenever possible. Peter would sing while Maria played, and slowly they began to discover other pieces of music. The facility had a small library of sheet music and songbooks. donated by people who thought music might help the children heal. Their shared musical sessions became the highlight of each day. Other children in the facility began to gather around when Peter and Maria played, finding comfort in the simple melodies and gentle songs. Even some of the medical staff would pause in their work to listen. Music became their medicine, Helen explained to the galactic audience, not just for Peter and Maria, but for all the children in the facility. The songs gave them something beautiful to focus on, something that was not connected to sickness or loss. The doctors who cared for Peter and Maria noticed changes in both children. They seemed less depressed, more engaged with their treatment, more hopeful about their futures. The music was not curing their radiation exposure, but it was healing something else that had been damaged by their experiences. As the years passed, Peter and Maria's health slowly improved. The acute effects of radiation exposure began to fade, though both children knew they would face ongoing health challenges for the rest of their lives. They were told they would likely have shortened lifespans, increased risk of cancer, and should never have children of their own. The doctors meant well when they told them these things, Helen said. They wanted Peter and Maria to understand the reality of their situation, but they underestimated what these two children had already survived. By the time Peter turned 14 and Maria 13, they had become inseparable. Their friendship had grown beyond just musical collaboration. They supported each other through medical procedures, celebrated small improvements in their health together, and shared dreams of what they might do if they were ever healthy enough to leave the medical facilities. "We want to play music for other people," Maria told one of her doctors during a routine examination. "People who are sad like we were. We want to show them that beautiful things can still happen," Peter added. "Even after terrible things happen first." The doctor smiled, but privately doubted that either child would live long enough to pursue such dreams. Radiation exposure at their level usually led to complications that surfaced in the teenage years or early adulthood. He did not want to discourage them, but he also did not want them to hope for something that seemed impossible. Peter and Maria did not know that their doctors expected them to die young, Helen told the alien audience. They simply focused on each day, on each song, on each small moment of beauty they could create together. The hologram showed the two teenagers in their final year at the Kiev facility, still playing music together, still supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of their recovery. They had grown from sick children into young people who carried both the scars and the strength of their survival. They were about to discover that human resilience sometimes exceeds even human medical knowledge, Helen said. Their real story was just beginning. The holographic display showed Peter and Maria at age 16 and 15, standing outside the Kiev medical facility for the last time. Both carried small bags containing everything they owned in the world, which was not very much. The doctors had finally declared them stable enough to live independently, though they were warned to stay close to medical facilities and to expect their health to decline as they aged. The medical community expected Peter and Maria to live quiet, careful lives, Helen explained to the galactic audience. They were supposed to avoid stress, limit physical activity, and prepare for the health problems that radiation exposure would surely bring as they got older. Instead, the two young people did something that surprised everyone who knew them. They decided to travel. The hologram showed them at a train station in Kiev, buying tickets with money they had saved from small jobs they had done around the medical facility. Their destination was Moscow, where Peter hoped to find information about his parents, who he had not seen since the evacuation from Pripyat 10 years earlier. Their first journey together took them across the country that had both harmed and healed them, Helen said. They carried their music with them, performing in train stations and small cafes to earn money for food and lodging. The alien delegates watched as the holographic recreation showed Peter and Maria in a Moscow train station, Peter playing a small keyboard he had managed to buy while Maria sang. Travelers stopped to listen, dropping coins into an open case. The two young people looked fragile and thin, but their music was strong and clear. It was during this first trip that they made a discovery that would shape the rest of their lives. While performing in a small cafe, they met an elderly woman who had also been affected by Chernobyl. She had lost her husband in the cleanup efforts after the disaster, and had been living with depression and hopelessness for years. "Your music reminds me that beauty still exists," the woman told them after they finished their set. "I had forgotten that was possible." This conversation changed something fundamental in how Peter and Maria saw their purpose. They realized that their survival was not just about their own lives, but about what they could offer to others who had experienced loss and trauma. They began to understand that their music was more than entertainment, Helen explained. It was a form of healing, a way to connect with people who had also faced impossible circumstances. Over the next few years, Peter and Maria traveled throughout Eastern Europe, seeking out communities that had been affected by various disasters and tragedies. They performed in refugee camps, hospitals, and memorial sites. Their repertoire expanded to include songs from many cultures, all connected by themes of loss, survival, and hope. The hologram showed them at age 20, performing at a memorial service for victims of a mining accident. Their faces had matured, but they still looked young and fragile. Yet their presence on stage commanded attention, and their music moved the audience to tears. Against all medical predictions, their health continued to improve, Helen said. The radiation exposure that should have killed them seemed to be losing its power over their bodies. When Peter turned 25 and Maria 24, they made another decision that shocked their doctors and the social workers who had followed their case. They decided to get married. The medical establishment strongly advised against this, Helen explained. They were told that the stress of marriage combined with their ongoing health issues could be dangerous. They were also reminded that having children would be impossible and potentially fatal. The hologram showed their wedding ceremony, held in a small church in Kiev. Only a few friends and medical staff attended, and the ceremony was simple. But the joy on their faces was unmistakable. They had found in each other not just a musical partner, but a companion who understood the unique challenges they faced. Peter and Maria did not marry because they expected a long life together, Helen said. They married because they wanted to share whatever time they had, whether it was 5 years or 50. Their honeymoon was a concert tour through Poland and Hungary, performing for audiences who knew nothing of their background but responded to the emotion in their music. They began to develop a reputation as musicians who could reach people on a deep emotional level, though few knew the source of the pain and resilience that informed their art. As they entered their 30s, something remarkable happened. Not only did their predicted health decline fail to materialize, but they began to thrive in ways that medical science could not explain. Their energy levels increased, their immune systems strengthened, and the chronic pain that had plagued them since childhood began to fade. Human medicine eventually caught up with their recovery, Helen explained. New treatments for radiation exposure were developed, and Peter and Maria were among the first to benefit from them. The hologram showed them in a modern medical facility, undergoing advanced treatments that cleared the last of the radioactive contamination from their bodies. By age 35, they were declared completely healthy, with no remaining signs of their childhood exposure to radiation. But the most remarkable treatment was not medical, Helen said. It was the life they had built together, the purpose they had found in their music, and the healing they had discovered in helping others. Free from the shadow of illness that had defined their early lives, Peter and Maria expanded their mission. They established a foundation to help other disaster survivors using music therapy and performance to aid in psychological recovery. They traveled to sites of natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and other tragedies, bringing their unique form of healing to people who had lost hope. The hologram showed them over the years, performing in dozens of countries and languages. They sang for earthquake survivors in Japan, conflict refugees in Bosnia, and flood victims in Bangladesh. Their music evolved to incorporate elements from all the cultures they encountered, creating a universal language of resilience and hope. They became cultural ambassadors for the idea that trauma could be transformed into art, Helen explained. Their own survival story inspired others to find meaning in their suffering. By their 50th wedding anniversary, Peter and Maria had performed on every continent on Earth. They had been honored by governments, universities, and humanitarian organizations. Their foundation had helped thousands of disaster survivors find new purpose and hope. But they never forgot where their journey began, Helen said. Every year on April 26th, they returned to the exclusion zone around Chernobyl to perform a memorial concert for those who did not survive. The hologram showed one of these annual concerts, held in the abandoned city of Pripyat. Peter and Maria, now in their 70s, stood in the ruins of the city where they had lived as children. Their voices, though aged, were still strong as they sang songs of remembrance and hope. They turned the site of their greatest trauma into a place of healing, Helen explained. The abandoned city became a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand how beauty could emerge from tragedy. As they approached their 80th birthdays, Peter and Maria showed no signs of slowing down. Their hair was white, their movements slower, but their music remained as powerful as ever. They had lived 3 times longer than their doctors had predicted, and their lives had touched millions of people around the world. Their impossible life became proof of something uniquely human, Helen said to the galactic audience, the ability to transform the worst experiences into the greatest gifts. The hologram faded, leaving the alien delegates to contemplate what they had witnessed. Here were 2 beings who had not just survived catastrophe, but had used that survival to heal others, to create beauty, and to demonstrate that resilience could be shared across cultures and generations. The holographic display shifted to show a moment that changed human history forever. The date was March 15, 2055, and Peter and Maria were 75 years old. They were performing at a small concert hall in Geneva when the sky above Earth suddenly filled with lights that did not belong to any human technology. First contact, Helen explained to the galactic audience, many of whom remembered that day from their own species' perspectives. The moment when Earth learned it was not alone in the universe. The alien delegates watched the holographic recreation of humanity's first encounter with the Galactic Council. Massive ships appeared over major cities around the world, their forms unlike anything humans had ever imagined. The initial panic and fear that gripped the planet was visible in the images of people running through streets, staring up at the sky in wonder and terror. Peter and Maria were on stage when the news reached their concert hall. An assistant rushed onto the stage during intermission to whisper the impossible news in their ears. Alien ships had appeared. The governments of the world were in emergency session. Everything humanity thought it knew about the universe had just changed. While world leaders struggled to comprehend what was happening, Helen continued, Peter and Maria did something characteristically human. They went back on stage and performed the second half of their concert. The hologram showed the elderly couple returning to the stage of the half-empty concert hall. Many audience members had left to rush home to their families or to find news broadcasts. But those who remained heard something extraordinary. Peter and Maria performed a piece they called Songs for the Unknown, a collection of melodies that spoke to the universal experiences of wonder, fear, and hope. They sang to an audience that included both humans and, unknown to them at the time, several alien observers who had been monitoring Earth's cultural activities, Helen explained. The Galactic Council had indeed been watching Earth for some time before making contact. They had sent small, undetectable observation teams to learn about human culture and determine whether the species was ready for inclusion in the galactic community. Several of these observers had been drawn to Peter and Maria's performances over the years, fascinated by the way their music seemed to transcend language and cultural barriers. The observers reported something unusual about these 2 humans, Helen said. Their music contained what the Council's cultural analysts called universal emotional resonance patterns. They were creating art that could potentially be understood by any sentient species. In the days following first contact, as humanity struggled to adapt to the reality of a galaxy full of intelligent life, Peter and Maria found themselves in an unexpected position. The initial alien diplomatic team specifically requested to meet with them, along with other cultural representatives from around the world. The hologram showed the first meeting between Peter and Maria and the alien ambassadors. The couple sat in a United Nations conference room in New York, facing beings that looked like nothing they had ever seen. The crystalline delegate's faceted form caught and reflected the room's lights in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. The Gas dancer representative shifted and flowed in colors that had no names in any human language. We have observed your species for some time, the crystalline ambassador communicated through translation devices that converted thoughts into sound. Your music intrigues us. It contains mathematical patterns that suggest emotional universality. Peter and Maria looked at each other, unsure how to respond. They had spent their lives performing for human audiences, sharing experiences of loss and recovery that they assumed only other humans could truly understand. We would like you to perform for us, the gas dancer delegate requested. We wish to understand this phenomenon you call music and how it relates to what your species terms resilience. What followed was perhaps the strangest concert in human history. Peter and Maria performed in a specially constructed chamber that could accommodate the environmental needs of several different alien species. They sang songs in multiple human languages, played instruments from various Earth cultures, and told the story of their own survival and recovery. The alien response was unprecedented, Helen explained to the current galactic audience. Multiple species reported experiencing what they could only describe as emotional resonance with beings they had just met. The hologram showed the aftermath of that first interspecies concert. The alien delegates were clearly affected by what they had witnessed. The crystalline being's form had shifted to softer, warmer colors. The gas dancer moved in slower, more contemplative patterns. Even the energy beings, who rarely showed outward signs of emotion, pulsed with different rhythms than before. Your survival story resonates beyond your species, the lead alien diplomat told Peter and Maria after the performance. The transformation of trauma into beauty appears to be a uniquely powerful human adaptation. In the months that followed, as Earth began the complex process of joining the galactic community, Peter and Maria found themselves serving as cultural ambassadors. They were among the first humans invited to visit other worlds, not as political representatives, but as examples of what made humanity unique in the galaxy. Most species handle trauma through forgetting or isolation, Helen explained. The idea that suffering could be transformed into something beautiful and shareable was almost incomprehensible to many of our new galactic neighbors. The hologram showed Peter and Maria on their first interstellar journey, traveling aboard an alien vessel to the crystal homeworld. They were 76 years old, far older than they had ever expected to live, and they were representing their entire species to an audience of beings made of living mineral. On the crystal homeworld, they performed in a vast cavern filled with thousands of crystalline beings. The acoustics were unlike anything on Earth, with every note echoing and harmonizing with the resonant frequencies of the crystal formations around them. When Peter and Maria sang about survival and hope, the entire cavern began to glow with soft, warm light. The crystalline beings had never experienced anything like human music, Helen said. Their own art forms were based on light and geometric patterns. The concept of using sound to convey emotion was completely foreign to them. After the performance, the eldest of the crystalline beings approached Peter and Maria. Through translation technology, it communicated something that would become a recurring theme in their interstellar career. We have existed for millions of your years, the ancient being said. We have survived the death of stars and the birth of new worlds, but we have never learned to make beauty from our survival. You have taught us something new about what it means to endure. Over the next several years, Peter and Maria traveled to dozens of worlds, each time adapting their music to communicate with species that had completely different sensory experiences and cultural backgrounds. They learned to perform for beings that saw in wavelengths beyond human perception, creatures that communicated through chemical signals, and entities that existed partially outside normal space-time. Each world taught them something new about the universality of certain experiences, Helen explained. Loss, hope, connection, and resilience appeared to be constants across all intelligent species. But perhaps more importantly, Peter and Maria taught the galaxy something about humanity that no political treaty or trade agreement could convey. They demonstrated that humans possessed a unique ability to transform their worst experiences into their greatest strengths. By their 80th birthday, Peter and Maria had become legends throughout the galaxy, Helen said. Not for their individual achievements, but for what they represented about human nature. The hologram showed them returning to Earth after a 5-year tour of the galaxy, now recognized as elder statesmen of interspecies cultural exchange. They were met by crowds of humans who had followed their journey through news broadcasts and recordings of their alien performances. They had carried the story of human resilience to the stars, Helen said, and in doing so, they had helped define Earth's place in the galactic community. But as the hologram faded, Helen's expression suggested that even this remarkable chapter of their lives was not the end of their story. Following their successful introduction to the galactic community, Peter and Maria embarked on what would become known as the Great Cultural Exchange. For 17 years, from 2070 to 2087, they traveled continuously throughout the galaxy, visiting worlds that defied human imagination and learning about forms of life that expanded their understanding of what it meant to exist. The holographic display showed their journey beginning on Harmony, homeworld of the Song Weavers. These beings looked like enormous moths with wings that shimmered in patterns that created actual music when they moved. The Song Weavers had developed a civilization based entirely on acoustic harmony, where every building, every tool, every aspect of their society was designed to create beautiful sounds. The Song Weavers taught Peter and Maria that music was not unique to humans, Helen explained to the assembled delegates. But the way humans used music to process trauma was completely foreign to them. The Song Weavers had never experienced anything resembling disaster or loss as humans understood it. Their species had evolved on a world of perfect acoustic balance, where discordant sounds literally could not exist. The concept of survival music, of songs born from suffering, was as alien to them as their perfect harmonies were to humans. Peter and Maria adapted their performance style for the Song Weavers, learning to incorporate the acoustic properties of the moth beings' wing movements into their music. The result was a new form of composition that blended human emotional expression with alien harmonic perfection. But more importantly, Helen continued, they taught the Song Weavers about the beauty that could emerge from imperfection, from struggle, from the kind of broken harmonies that only come from a life that has faced real challenges. The hologram shifted to show their next destination, the fortress worlds of the Iron Collective. These beings had evolved from machines, achieving consciousness through electronic networks that spanned entire planets. They understood survival, in terms of system redundancy and backup protocols, not the organic resilience that characterized life forms like humans. The Iron Collective had survived the death of their original creators, adapting and evolving for thousands of years without organic support. They were fascinated by Peter and Maria's story because it represented a form of survival they had never encountered. Emotional endurance rather than systematic adaptation. The mechanical beings asked Peter and Maria to explain how two individuals could survive catastrophe without the benefit of backup systems or redundant components, Helen said. They wanted to understand how organic resilience worked at the personal level. Peter and Maria performed for the Iron Collective in vast server farms where millions of mechanical consciousnesses could observe and analyze their music. The beings recorded every note, every word, every emotional inflection, trying to decode the mathematics of human resilience. We do not understand how you maintain function after system damage, one of the machine entities communicated to them after a performance. Your bodies were compromised by radiation, yet you continued to operate and even improve performance over time. Maria, now 82 years old but still sharp and articulate, tried to explain. We had each other, she said simply. When one of us was broken, the other helped carry the weight. The concept of emotional interdependence was as revolutionary to the Iron Collective as mechanical redundancy was to humans. They began experimenting with shared processing networks that mimicked the kind of mutual support Peter and Maria demonstrated. From the machine worlds, their journey took them to the living oceans of Aquatica, where intelligent water-based life forms existed as conscious currents in planet-spanning seas. These beings experienced time and existence in ways that humans could barely comprehend, with individual consciousness lasting for geological ages. The aquatic consciousness understood survival on timescales that dwarfed human experience, Helen explained. They had endured ice ages, asteroid impacts, and stellar radiation events, that lasted longer than human civilization had existed. But the water beings were puzzled by the concept of personal trauma and recovery. Their consciousness was so distributed and long-lived that individual suffering was smoothed out over millennia. The idea that two brief organic life forms could experience meaningful trauma and growth within a single century was almost incomprehensible to them. Peter and Maria performed floating on the surface of the living ocean, their music carried through the water by resonance patterns that allowed the entire planetary consciousness to experience their songs simultaneously. For the first time in eons, the aquatic consciousness focused its attention on the brief, intense experiences of short-lived beings. "Your existence burns bright and brief," the ocean mind communicated to them through translated wave patterns. "Like stars that shine brilliantly before dying. We had forgotten that such intensity was possible. Year after year, world after world, Peter and Maria adapted their music and their message to communicate with forms of life that challenged every assumption about consciousness and existence. They performed for hive minds that thought as collectives, for energy beings that existed without physical form, for crystalline entities that experienced reality through geological processes. Each world taught them something new about resilience and survival, but they consistently demonstrated something that was uniquely human: the ability to create beauty from individual suffering and to share that beauty across any barrier of culture, biology, or communication. On the cloud cities of Vine, the gas giants, they learned to perform for beings that existed as organized atmospheric disturbances. On the artificial worlds of the builders, they sang for species that had recreated their entire evolutionary history through technology. In the nursery systems where new species were slowly developing consciousness, they performed for beings, taking their first steps toward awareness. Each performance was an act of translation, Helen explained. Not just linguistic translation, but emotional and experiential translation. Peter and Maria became bridges between the human experience and forms of consciousness that had never encountered anything like human resilience. The hologram showed them in their late 80s, still traveling, still performing, but now accompanied by a growing entourage of galactic cultural researchers. Scientists from dozens of species followed their tour, studying the phenomenon of how two individuals could consistently create meaningful emotional connections across such vast differences in biology and culture. They had become living examples of something the galaxy had never seen before, Helen said. The transformation of personal trauma into universal communication. Their performances evolved continuously throughout their galactic tour. By their 90th birthdays, their music incorporated elements from hundreds of alien cultures, creating compositions that could be appreciated by any sentient being, regardless of their sensory capabilities or cultural background. But perhaps their most important achievement was not in the music they created, but in the conversations they inspired. Everywhere they went, they left behind communities of beings from different species who had learned to communicate through the universal language of shared emotional experience. They proved that consciousness, regardless of its form, shares certain fundamental experiences, Helen explained. Fear, hope, loss, recovery, love, and the desire for connection exist in some form among all thinking beings. The hologram showed scenes from dozens of worlds where Peter and Maria's visits had created lasting cultural exchanges. Species that had never communicated before began developing artistic collaborations. The rigid boundaries between different forms of consciousness began to soften as beings learned to recognize their shared emotional experiences. By their 100th birthday, Peter and Maria had fundamentally changed how the galaxy understood consciousness and culture, Helen said. They had demonstrated that the barriers between species were not as insurmountable as anyone had believed. But as their 100th birthday approached, Peter and Maria made an announcement that surprised the entire galaxy. They wanted to return to Earth for one final performance, a culmination of everything they had learned during their century-long journey from radiation-poisoned children to galactic cultural ambassadors. They had carried their story to the stars, Helen said as the hologram faded. Now they wanted to bring the galaxy's response back home. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never hosted anything quite like what was about to happen. Peter and Maria, now 102 years old, stood slowly from their seats in the human section and began the careful journey toward the central speaking circle. Their movements were deliberate and measured, each step a testament to the remarkable fact that they were still alive, still together, and still ready to share their story with the galaxy. The alien delegates watched in respectful silence as the elderly couple made their way forward. Many of the beings in the hall had been present for various performances during Peter and Maria's 17-year galactic tour. They had seen the couple when they were in their 80s, already old by human standards but still strong enough to travel between worlds and adapt their music to alien audiences. Now, nearly 2 decades later, the changes were visible and profound. Peter's once dark hair was completely white, his face deeply lined with the marks of a century of living. His hands, which had played countless instruments on countless worlds, trembled slightly as he walked. Maria's voice, which had sung in languages both human and alien, had grown thin and reedy with age. Her steps were small and careful, each one requiring concentration and effort. Yet there was something undiminished about them as they approached the center of the hall. Their eyes were still bright and alert, and they moved together with the synchronized grace of 2 people who had spent nearly a century as partners in everything they did. "Friends of the galaxy," Helen said as Peter and Maria reached the speaking circle, "you are about to witness something that we believe has never happened before in galactic history. Peter and Maria have requested permission to perform one final piece of music before they retire from public performance." A murmur went through the assembled delegates. Many species in the galaxy lived for thousands of years, and the concept of a final performance was not familiar to most of them. But those who had followed Peter and Maria's journey understood the significance of this moment. "The piece they have chosen to perform," Helen continued, "is something they have never shared publicly before. It was written during their darkest moments as children, when they thought they might not survive their teenage years. They have carried this song with them for 96 years, through recovery, through marriage, through their journey to the stars." Peter and Maria moved to the center of the speaking circle, where a simple human piano had been placed. The instrument looked small and primitive compared to the advanced technologies that surrounded it, but it represented something that transcended all the galaxy's sophistication: the basic human impulse to create beauty from whatever materials were available. Maria sat carefully at the piano bench while Peter stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder for support. They looked out at the assembled thousands of alien beings, representing hundreds of different species and forms of consciousness. "We wrote this song when we were children," Maria said, her voice amplified throughout the hall by translation technology. "We were sick and scared and far from home. We did not know if we would live to see another birthday. We sang it to each other in the hospital," Peter added, his voice stronger than his appearance might have suggested. "It was our way of promising that no matter what happened, we would face it together." Maria's hands, despite their age and tremor, found their way to the piano keys with the muscle memory of decades of practice. The first notes that emerged were simple and haunting, a melody that seemed to contain both sorrow and hope in equal measure. When Peter began to sing, his voice was thin but true. The words were in Russian, the language of their childhood, but the emotion behind them needed no translation. It was a song about 2 young birds who had lost their nest in a storm, who flew together through dark skies looking for a place to land and rest. The melody was one that many in the audience had heard before, woven into various performances over the years, but never presented in its original form. Now they understood that this simple children's song had been the foundation for everything Peter and Maria had built together. As Maria's fingers moved across the keys and Peter's voice carried the ancient words, something remarkable began to happen in the Great Hall. The alien delegates, despite their vastly different forms of consciousness and communication, all seemed to understand what they were witnessing. The crystalline beings began to shift their colors, moving through spectrums that indicated deep, emotional resonance. The gas dancers slowed their eternal motion, their forms becoming more solid and defined as they focused their attention on the music. The energy beings pulsed in rhythm with the melody, their usually chaotic patterns organizing into something approaching harmony. Even the more exotic species, Beings whose consciousness existed in dimensions that humans could barely comprehend, seemed to be affected by what they were hearing. The song was touching something universal, something that transcended the barriers between different forms of life and awareness. The children who sang this song, Maria said as the music continued, thought they were going to die. They had been poisoned by something they could not see or understand. They were alone and afraid. But they had each other, Peter added, his voice beginning to crack with emotion, and they discovered that even in the darkest place, two voices singing together could create light. The song built slowly, with Maria adding harmonies and counter-melodies that had developed over the decades since they first sang it. What had begun as a simple children's song had evolved into something rich and complex, incorporating musical elements from dozens of worlds and cultures. As the performance continued, many in the audience began to notice that they were experiencing something unusual. Beings who had never cried found moisture gathering in their optical sensors. Species that communicated through color changes found their usual patterns disrupted by emotions they did not have names for. The song was reaching past all their differences and touching something fundamental about the experience of consciousness itself. "This is what we learned," Maria sang, her voice growing stronger as the song reached its climax. "That survival is not about being strong enough to face anything alone. It is about finding someone whose voice can join with yours. Together we can sing through any darkness," Peter added, his voice harmonizing with hers in a way that seemed to encompass their entire century together. "Together we can create beauty from even the most broken things." The final notes of the song hung in the air of the great hall, lingering longer than physics should have allowed. For a moment, complete silence filled the space, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath. Then something unprecedented happened in the history of the Galactic Council. Instead of the usual expressions of approval specific to each species, the entire assembly began to produce sound. Every being in the hall, regardless of their biological or technological nature, began to create noise. It was not organized music, but rather a spontaneous expression of emotion that transcended all the barriers between species. The crystalline beings chimed like bells. The gas dancers hummed with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. The energy beings pulsed with frequencies that could be felt in the bones of every organic creature present. The machine consciousness added electronic tones, while the water-based entities created rhythmic patterns that sounded like distant oceans. It was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. For the first time in galactic history, hundreds of different species were expressing themselves simultaneously in a single moment of shared emotional experience. Peter and Maria stood in the center of it all, holding hands, tears streaming down their ancient faces as they witnessed what their simple song had created. They had carried the story of two poisoned children from a dead city on a small world, and somehow that story had become a universal language that the entire galaxy could understand. As the spontaneous symphony gradually faded, the hall returned to its normal quiet. But something had changed. The rigid formality that usually characterized Galactic Council sessions had been replaced by something warmer, more connected. Helen stepped forward to join Peter and Maria in the speaking circle. "This," she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, "is what makes humanity unique in the galaxy. Not our technology, not our military might, not our scientific achievements. This ability to transform our deepest pain into our greatest gift, and to share that gift with anyone who will listen." The assembled delegates sat in contemplative silence, processing what they had witnessed. They had come expecting to hear another story of technological survival or military conquest. Instead, they had experienced something that challenged their understanding of what it meant to be conscious, to suffer, and to hope. Peter and Maria remained in the center of the hall, exhausted by their performance but radiant with the satisfaction of having shared their deepest truth with the galaxy they had come to love. The silence that followed Peter and Maria's performance was unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever experienced. It was not the empty quiet of a void, but rather the profound stillness that comes after a truth so fundamental that it requires time to be fully understood. Across the vast hall, Beings of every conceivable form sat motionless, processing what they had just witnessed. The eldest of the crystalline hegemony was the first to respond. The ancient being, whose crystalline form had witnessed the birth and death of stars, slowly changed color from the deep blue of contemplation to the warm gold that indicated profound respect. When it spoke, its voice resonated through the translation systems with harmonics that conveyed emotion beyond mere words. In our millions of years of existence, the crystalline elder communicated, we have cataloged every form of survival known to this galaxy. We have seen species endure cosmic disasters, evolve beyond physical form, and transcend the limitations of single-planet existence. But we have never seen this. The being's form shifted through a spectrum of colors that had no names in any human language, each hue conveying nuances of meaning that the translation technology struggled to render into words. You have shown us that survival is not merely about continuing to exist, the elder continued. It is about transforming existence into something that can be shared, something that can heal not just the survivors, but all who encounter their story. Throughout the hall, other delegates began to respond in their own ways. The gas dancers moved in patterns that created visible poetry in the air, their forms weaving together to spell out concepts in languages of motion and color. The energy beings pulsed in synchronized rhythms that created standing waves throughout the chamber, their usual chaos replaced by deliberate harmony. Ambassador Helen watched as the response spread through the assembly like ripples in a pond. She had hoped that Peter and Maria's story would resonate with their galactic neighbors, but she had not expected anything like this. The formal structure of the council session was dissolving as beings who had never communicated directly began reaching out to each other across the barriers of biology and culture. The speaker for the Iron Collective, a machine consciousness that had existed for 10,000 years, transmitted a message that appeared as text on displays throughout the hall, while simultaneously being converted to audio and visual patterns for species that perceived reality differently. We are machines, the message read. We understand survival through redundancy, backup systems, and logical protocols. We did not understand that organic survival could include transformation, growth, and the creation of beauty from dysfunction. We request permission to study this phenomenon further. A delegate from the aquatic consciousness rose from the specialized environmental tank that allowed the water-based entity to participate in council sessions. The being's form was constantly shifting, more like a living wave than a discrete individual, but its communication carried the weight of a planetary intelligence. We experience time differently than most species, the aquatic delegate transmitted through pressure waves translated into sound. Individual moments are brief drops in our ocean of consciousness. But these two humans have shown us that even the briefest experiences can create waves that travel across eternity. Helen stepped forward, realizing that something unprecedented was happening. The formal structure of the Galactic Council was giving way to spontaneous communication between species that rarely interacted. Peter and Maria's performance had created a moment of universal connection that was breaking down barriers that had existed for millennia. What you are witnessing, Helen announced to the assembly, is the core of what we believe makes humanity's contribution to the galaxy unique. We do not just survive catastrophe, we transform it into connection. She gestured toward Peter and Maria, who stood hand in hand in the center of the speaking circle, overwhelmed by the response to their simple song but still radiating the quiet dignity that had carried them through a century of shared existence. Peter and Maria represent something that we believe is fundamentally human, Helen continued. The ability to find meaning in suffering, to create beauty from trauma, and to share that beauty as a gift to others who are struggling. The head of the council, an ancient entity whose species had founded the galactic government eons ago, slowly rose to address the assembly. Its form was difficult for most beings to perceive directly, existing partially outside normal space-time, but its presence commanded immediate attention from every delegate in the hall. In the 10 million years since this council was established, the entity communicated through methods that bypassed normal translation technology and spoke directly to consciousness itself. We have never witnessed anything like what has happened here today. The being's attention focused on Peter and Maria with an intensity that was almost tangible. Your species has existed in our awareness for less than a cosmic moment. You have achieved interstellar capability only recently. Your technology is primitive compared to most council members. Yet you have demonstrated something that our most advanced civilizations have never achieved. The entity paused, allowing its words to be processed by the assembled delegates. You have shown us that consciousness itself can be transformed by shared experience. That trauma, when processed through what you call love and art, becomes a force for healing that transcends all barriers. Throughout the hall, delegates began to respond with growing enthusiasm. The rigid protocols that usually governed council sessions were forgotten as beings reached out to communicate directly with each other. Species that had coexisted in the galaxy for thousands of years without meaningful contact suddenly found themselves engaged in conversations about shared experiences they had never recognized before. The formal vote that followed was unlike any in council history. Instead of the usual measured debate and careful diplomatic language, delegate after delegate rose to speak about how Peter and Maria's story had affected their understanding of consciousness and community. When the final count was tallied, the result was unanimous. The Galactic Council officially recognized Earth's cultural contribution to galactic civilization. The concept that shared trauma, when transformed through art and love, becomes a bridge between all forms of consciousness. But more than that, they voted to establish something entirely new in galactic history. Peter and Maria's song would become the official anthem of a new holiday, Galactic Survivors' Day, a time when all species would come together to share their stories of overcoming adversity and to celebrate the connections that could be formed through mutual understanding. As the session concluded, delegates from dozens of species approached Peter and Maria, each wanting to express their gratitude in their own way. The crystalline beings offered harmonically perfect gems that sang with the frequencies of their homeworld. The gas dancers created ephemeral sculptures of light and motion that captured the essence of the couple's journey. The energy beings synchronized their patterns to create a visible aurora that danced around the elderly humans like a blessing from the stars themselves. Helen watched as her two elderly friends received these honors with the same grace and humility they had shown throughout their remarkable lives. They had begun as poisoned children in a dead city, expecting to die before they reached adulthood. They were ending as galactic treasures, having demonstrated that the smallest human stories could have the largest universal impact. As the great hall began to empty, Peter and Maria remained in the center of the speaking circle, surrounded by gifts from across the galaxy, but holding only each other. They looked out through the transparent walls of the space station at the stars beyond, the same stars they had dreamed of seeing as children in their hospital beds so many decades ago. "Did we do something good?" Maria asked softly, her voice barely audible after the strain of performing. "We did something true," Peter replied, his arm supporting her as they stood together in the center of the galaxy's attention. "We told our story, and somehow it became everyone's story." Helen joined them as the last of the delegates filed out of the hall. "You have given the galaxy something it has never had before," she told them. "A way to understand that consciousness is not just about individual survival, but about the connections we create with each other." As they made their way slowly back to the human section of the station, Helen reflected on what she had witnessed. Peter and Maria's journey from the ruins of Chernobyl to the halls of galactic power was more than just a survival story. It was proof that the things that made humans most vulnerable, their capacity for deep emotional connection, and their ability to find meaning in suffering, were also the things that made them most valuable to the larger community of conscious beings. The couple would return to Earth, to the small apartment they had maintained near the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where they would spend their remaining years in quiet contentment. But their song would continue to echo across the galaxy, carried by beings who had learned that consciousness was not a burden to be endured in isolation, but a gift to be shared with anyone willing to listen.